Have you ever experienced what it feels like to be a member of a strong product team, tasked with coming up with innovative solutions to genuine problems? The reality is, if you're coming from a feature team, you've probably never experienced this. Delivering outcomes is undeniably more difficult than just shipping features, but it's also most satisfying and meaningful. When you're switching from working in a feature team to working in an empowered product team, it's not just a new set of skills. That's actually the easy part. It involves a new mindset. The goal of this episode is to share the mindset and attitude behind members of strong product teams. This is not about the principles and techniques of discovery or delivery. It's about how to help someone be more effective as a member of a cross-functional team. Welcome back to Product Therapy, Marty. Glad to have you here.
Glad to be back, Christian. Looking forward to number 2.
Well, it's going to be a fun journey, I tell you. Every day as I go through coaching and advising teams, I see a lot of the issues we're talking about come up over and over again. And I really hope as we continue to share this in this podcast, we can help more and more teams do this. Today, as I talked about, I want to really talk about the mindset, or what we call the nature of product work. And to start, I want to play this clip from Steve Jobs. It comes from those lost tapes, the lost interview, and I really think it gets to the heart of this issue. So let's watch this clip.
One of the things that really hurt Apple was after I left, John Sculley got a very serious disease. And that disease, I've seen other people get it too. It's the disease of thinking that a really great idea is 90% of the work. And that if you just tell all these other people, here's this great idea, then of course they can go off and make it happen. And the problem with that is that there's just a tremendous amount of craftsmanship in between a great idea and a great product. And as you evolve that great idea, it changes and grows. It never comes out like it starts, because you learn a lot more as you get into the subtleties of it. And you also find there's tremendous trade-offs that you have to make. I mean, there are just certain things you can't make electrons do. There are certain things you can't make plastic do or glass do. And as you get into, or factories do, or robots do. And as you get into all these things, designing a product is keeping 5,000 things in your brain, these concepts, and fitting them all together in kind of continuing to push to fit them together in new and different ways to get what you want. And every day you discover something new that is a new problem or a new opportunity to fit these things together a little differently.
Christian, I think after seeing that clip, maybe many people don't know the history of that clip and don't know the origin story there. It's actually an amazing video. For the people I coach, I tell them it is literally the best product masterclass that they can get in an hour I've ever seen. The history is that little clip was recorded in 1995, believe it or not, long time ago. Steve Jobs had just been kicked out of his own company, Apple. He was sort of licking his wounds and trying to decide, what was next. He hadn't come back. And he rarely gave interviews on how to build products. Very rarely through his whole life. He talked about why you should buy his products, like why iPhones were awesome, things like that. But the art of the craft of product was pretty rare. And there was a special that was being done featuring these tech titans of the era, like Bill Gates. And they had recorded this interview, but they only used literally 7 minutes in a television show, a public television show. They were literally lost for a long time. What happened was eventually, Steve Jobs came back to Apple, took it from near bankruptcy to the most valuable company in the world. And then he sadly passed away, from pancreatic cancer. And after he died, one of the producers found a copy of the tapes in his garage. And he published this. It's on Apple TV. It's on Google Play. It's on Amazon Prime. It's $5. It's literally like €5, $5. And it's a largely unedited, just over an hour of his views on the craft of product. And what we just heard him describing was really product discovery. It's so interesting to see how this really hasn't changed, the craft of creating product, especially when we talk about the mindset. Now, the techniques, of course, have gotten better, and that's what we spend a lot of our time talking about. But the mindset is really what I'm hoping people could take from that. This idea that the idea itself, the item on a roadmap, is only 10% of the work, instead of what most people think of it as 90% of the work. And then it's just a small matter of design and coding for the feature team to build this. And then they don't understand why the products are so unimpressive, why customers rarely buy it or even think it's very good. And what he's trying to describe is the real work that goes on. So yes, you've identified an opportunity, you've identified a problem to solve. The real work is in coming up with that solution. And that's where product teams come into the picture.
But Marty, when I think about this disease, and he kind of describes it as this disease of senior executives thinking an idea is the big chunk of the work. I came up with a good idea. If I just throw into the team, we will get a great product. Is there some root of that thinking in leadership? Why is it so prevalent that many leaders think their job is just to come up with a great idea?
The biggest issue is because most of them have never done product before. They might be a very accomplished marketing executive or sales executive or any of these things, and they think they see something that needs to be done. It's human nature. And so they say, if we just do this, I'm sure I could sell it. And it's just not understanding what the difference between identifying a need and coming up with a solution that actually works. Of course, the way we define that is something that they'll buy, something they can use, something that we can build, and something that works for our business. And that's much harder. Good product organizations understand that's where the real work is. That's where innovation happens.
And Marty, if I am an individual contributor and I have leaders that have probably never seen good product work, and I'm trying to change their mind of what happens between an idea and actually delivering something that customers will love and works for our business, how would you frame it to an executive? You're like, that's a great idea, but there's something else that happens afterwards. How do I tell them what that is?
First of all, don't fight your customers. Don't fight your executives and start yelling at them about giving you a solution rather than a problem. They're just being human. We all do that. I catch myself doing it all the time, even though I should know better. We all do that. But instead, what we like to say and coach them to do is say, all right, that seems like an interesting idea. I think we should try that out. I want to make sure that whatever we do, it works for you. It works for our customers. Can you help me define success? Let's define what success is. If success is just shipping a feature, even if it doesn't solve the customer problem, then we understand that, but we doubt that's what you want. And it's usually pretty clear where this might be coming from. So you might say, are you suggesting this feature because we have a problem with our international sales and this will help our international sales? Or are you suggesting it for some other reason? And okay, maybe it's international sales. What would you consider a good use of our time? How much of an improvement? A simple dialogue with the stakeholders, with the executives about this to understand what the bar is that we're trying to achieve. That's the first part. The second part is then saying, okay, now as we try out these ideas, every time we try something out, we get some data. We share like, okay, the good news is we're making progress on that. Maybe the bad news is not enough progress, or maybe we haven't made progress. And the point is to, over time, show your executives that you know how to achieve the outcome that they need. That's what this is all about, is moving to outcomes. You can do that just by making sure you're setting it up as delivering on what they're asking for.
And you kind of mentioned helping them articulate what the problem is. And if you've probably heard this quote, I hear it a lot of times, this Einstein quote where people tell me, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and just 5 minutes thinking about solutions. I have heard lots of people talk about fall in love with the problem. You know, they quote that a lot as their reasoning for spending a lot of time talking about the problem, a lot of time conducting research in problem definition phases in some ways. Now, I have had some concerns with that. Not because I don't fundamentally agree that understanding a problem is good, but I kind of want to hear your sense of what's wrong with really this mindset of problem discovery versus solution discovery.
I mean, that's a big topic. And it's kind of two different topics. We should talk about each of them. The first one, there's no question. If you don't understand the problem, you're in trouble, right? Good luck coming up with a good solution if you don't understand the problem. So there is no question you need to make sure you understand the problem. However, most of the time, it's not very hard to understand the problem, especially when you're given a product strategy that spells out the problem and the evidence for that problem. And I will tell you, this is one of those triggers for a lot of executives and stakeholders. If they've done all this work in a product strategy to clarify the problem, and the product team just says, well, we don't care what you've done. We want to go figure it out for ourselves. Then they feel like that's just gratuitous, right? That's just gratuitous. It's like, come on, if you have any evidence that this is not a real problem, let us hear it. But otherwise, why don't we focus on the thing that people are going to buy, which is the solution? And this is where, the Einstein quote, I love that quote, but we're not just trying to solve the problem. We're trying to solve the problem better than the alternatives that are out there. My favorite, I think even more relevant quote, I'm sure Ben would appreciate the coming above Einstein on this, but Ben Horowitz likes to say, this is what's hard about product. People won't buy your product unless they view your solution as on the order of 10 times better than what's out there. Now, anybody could tell you, you don't have to be Einstein to tell you that's hard. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of iterating on that solution. So while you do need to understand the problem, your real time needs to go into trying out many solutions to get one that actually does what you need it to do. If people don't switch to your product, if they don't choose to use that feature, it's a lot of work for nothing. That is why fall in love with the problem versus the solution, that's great because we're going to be trying a lot of solutions. If you get too attached to one solution, it slows you down. But you don't need much time to fall in love with a problem. Most of the time, the problem is very well understood. I mean, pick any of your favorite products. They're rarely new problems. They're existing problems that we all have. What's different is the solution.
Now, Marty, going back to how this cycle may feed executives in understanding the true nature of product work. If I'm giving an idea to a team, could it be because I just see the team talking about the problem and I'm thinking, are they struggling to come up with a solution? Maybe it's my role to come up with a solution. I have to coach product teams and talk about why product is hard. And I say, it's problems are not new. The idea of innovation is that we're using technology that is just now available to try to come up with a new solution to this problem. But, talking about the problem is absolutely important in trying to solve it. But the hard part of the work is not just find a solution that people will choose, people will buy, or people will use, or that we can build and works for our business, but one, to your point, that is compelling enough for people to switch behavior, to stop using something else and to start using something else. And I think it's an important distinction when we kind of talk about what it means to be on a good product team or what good product work looks like. It's not ignoring the problem or understanding it, but the recognition that the real essence of our work, the hard part of it, is that we have to try many things to come up with something that is compelling enough.
Another one that ties right into that is the role of enabling technology. And of course, we're in the midst of a major technology shift with generative AI. Enabling technology helps open up the landscape of possibilities on the solution. That's what's powerful about that. This is why every time there's a new disruptive technology, it's a golden era for product because now we have another tool to be able to solve long-standing problems for our customers in ways that are just now possible. We're hungry for these new technologies and we need our engineers to work with us on this, but that's the part where we're really contributing. The team is to come up with that solution. The problem we all need to understand, but honestly, it's not that hard to understand the problem.
I like that a lot. And when we're trying to solve the problem, Marty, one of the things we often talk about is functional skills being critical to solving a problem. And people walk into that. Many companies come to terms with, all right, we recognize there's risk involved when we're solving a problem. We've got to ensure it's viable, it's valuable, it's usable, we can build it. But many companies still walk sequentially when tackling this risk. Maybe say a little about your argument for why cross-functional skills are critical in good work.
Yeah, and it's there's sort of two things. There's the cross-functional skills and then the way those skills collaborate. Those are two different things. So for example, let's tackle your first point. Why is it so important not to be sequential? The reason is, and what I'm describing, by the way, I mean, when I first was taught product, this is what I was taught. This is the way it was done early on, which was a product manager would gather and document requirements. That was what it was all about. They were called PRDs. Today they're called user stories, but they're more like, this is what we believe it needs to be from the product manager's perspective. And then we would give those requirements to a designer, and that designer was asked to craft an experience that delivers those requirements. And then the experience and the requirements were given to the engineers, and they were told to literally implement those requirements. But in that model, there was very little innovation because the innovation mostly comes the opposite direction. It comes from the engineers knowing what's just now possible and informing the experience and the functionality. So that's what led the insight. I mean, this happened a long time ago, but we realized that with great product teams, you don't want to work sequentially. You want to work collaboratively. In other words, the engineers, the designers, the product managers each bring a different set of skills. And what we're trying to do is simultaneously solve for all constraints. So we need something that is technically feasible. We need something that's also a great user experience. We also need something that's legal and compliant and something we can afford and something we can monetize and market and sell. That's the viability. And most importantly, we need it to be so good that customers will switch and choose us. That's viable. Our best chance of success is to not only not be sequential, but to be truly collaborative. So it's a back and forth on how we come up with something worth building.
People talk about collaboration as one of those buzzwords and everywhere. And I've not found a better word to describe it. And I always say it's solving a problem together. Like that's the truest form of what it means. One of the earliest insights I was reading about how kind of the NASA story of how NASA was formed in the late 50s, early 60s when they were in a space war with USSR, with Russia. And NASA's first mission was to land a man on the moon. That was the announcement by the president. And so they kind of went on this quest to land a man on the moon. And one of the early discoveries was like, where on the moon do we land the man? Like what side of the moon? We don't know what it looks like. So they actually changed the first mission to let's take a picture of the surface of the moon, so that we can identify the best place to land a man. And this was a hard engineering problem in the late 50s, 60s. You got to take a picture in space. You have to process that image. Then you got to send it all the way back to Earth. And we were, processing pictures in the photo lab when we hang up pictures and they come out black and white in the 50s. But, NASA has rocket scientists, these smart engineers, and they're like, we are going to tackle this. We're going to fix this. They came back months later and they had engineered something almost the size of half a baseball field. This giant long telescope, they had a breakthrough with radio waves, which was great. But like every good engineer, they had rebuilt a photo lab in a box to process pictures. And it was just so heavy and clunky. And there was kind of this question of like, this is great. It seems like it solves the problem, but how do we send something like this up to space? And it was actually this mission that actually had NASA go look for a set of people called designers. They kind of came to this realization, well, we've got to design something that can go to space. And we've got to fit something that we can engineer into that design. We can't engineer separately from design, and it's like technology and functionality and they're all intertwined. And when you see a very big organization with unlimited funds kind of come to this realization that even having smart people is not enough. They have to work together. You have to bring the right set of cross-functional skills and they have to solve a problem together. One of the very interesting stories about this. Now, I want to play another clip from the Steve Jobs video. He kind of talks about this true nature of collaboration.
What I've always felt that a team of people doing something they really believe in is like when I was a young kid. There was a widowed man that lived up the street, and he was in his 80s. He's a little scary looking, and I got to know him a little bit. I think he might have paid me to mow his lawn or something. And one day he said, "Come on into my garage. I want to show you something." And he pulled out this dusty old rock tumbler. It was a motor and a coffee can and a little band between them. And he said, "Come on with me." We went out to the back and we got some rocks, some regular old ugly rocks. And we put them in the can with a little bit of liquid and a little bit of grit powder. And we closed the can up and he turned this motor on. He said, "Come back tomorrow." And his can was making a racket as the stones were on. And I came back the next day and we opened the can and we took out these amazingly beautiful polished rocks. The same common stones that had gone in through rubbing against each other like this, creating a little bit of friction, creating a little bit of noise, had come out these beautiful polished rocks. And that's always been in my mind, my metaphor for a team working really hard on something they're passionate about is that it's through the team, through that group of incredibly talented people bumping up against each other, having arguments, having fights sometimes, making some noise, and working together, they polish each other. And they polish the ideas, and what comes out are these really beautiful stones.
Okay, here's another great clip that not only describes true collaboration like we talked about, but calls out something that is often underscored about collaboration, Marty, and that's the friction. Could you talk about the different ways you've seen this friction, Marty, and why it's so important?
Yeah, I really do think, and this is something that I think a product coach, especially a discovery coach, spends a lot of time helping people understand, because unless you've worked in an environment like this, it can feel very counterintuitive. How many people do we know? Most people probably we know are naturally non-confrontational. There's always some people that are very confrontational, but we generally don't like to work with those people. We like everybody to get along. And I want everybody to get along. Don't get me wrong. However, when you have people who are passionate about solving a hard problem and they each bring different skills, then it is a sign of them being good when they create friction. And that's what Steve Jobs was describing. So I thought beautifully, the friction that creates this beautiful, gem, stone. And it doesn't go in that way. Like he said, an idea starts out really rough, but when we work on it and we get these different skills rubbing up against it, we come up with something that's kind of magical. And I've been on many of those teams. And honestly, once you've felt what it's like to work on a team like that, that's all you want to work on. And I will tell you, the main defining characteristic of every day was a lot of argument. A lot of argument. But I will also say that this is why psychological safety is so important. Psychological safety means we can have those arguments and not intend or take it personally. What you're realizing is that we need the designer to raise an objection if there's an objection. We need the engineers to be comfortable. We do not want anybody on a product team deferring to the product manager because they're the product manager. Just like we don't want anybody to defer on anything other than for the reason that they agree this is the right solution. This is a much better solution. So when I coach product teams, I'm encouraging that friction. I'm encouraging it, but I want to make sure it's respectful friction. In other words, we can disagree on the particular approach without disagreeing on anybody's intentions.
Oh, you call up a lot of great points here. I've seen many people confuse healthy friction with dysfunction. It's like they're arguing in a room, they're brainstorming. They cannot agree about things. And it's almost trying to call out the nature of good product work requires this friction. The polishing, it's I always talk about if solving a problem is so hard, it's probably because you don't have the right people in the room. helping you with it. It's if you have a designer, I've always seen this right brain, abstract thinking people, very creative, very empathetic in their views, and an engineer with almost a very left brain, concrete, black and white thinking view. And you put these people in a room, you will expect that they don't see eye to eye on how to go about solving a problem. But really the magic of product work is that friction is what creates good product, because it's how you tackle risk. It's you have the mindset of people thinking about not just, is there a better way to do it? Is it possible? Can we build it now? What are this? I'm putting someone thinking about how people will experience the value, what people will feel about it. You call out something there, psychological safety. And I don't want to lose that point, because I recall a couple of years ago, Google underwent this 2-year study to try to uncover the secret behind team performance, like what made for good teams. And you can imagine many of the early thoughts were like, well, maybe Marty is on the team. He's a rock star. It must be because of Marty, or someone has been there for 20 years. Maybe it's tenure or experience or expertise. But the story reveals that the highest performing teams had one thing in common, and that's psychological safety, that believe that you could speak up without being ridiculed or challenged. You could go from conflict to commitment very quickly. You could have that friction and then yield something magical about it. Why do you think that popped up as I know it's no surprise for you, but there are two dynamics here. One is, it was even a surprise for Google to uncover this, but it's also something that people don't talk about enough.
They don't talk about it enough. And it's easy just to consider it just a buzzword, but it really shows up in practice every day that teams are working together on a hard problem. I have to coach people that not only is this, their job, but it's their obligation. If they see something that they don't think is right and they don't say anything, that's like the worst situation. For a long time, by the way, this was true at early Google. They thought the secret to great teams was to hire very specific people that came from a very specific education. Not only, basically these were computer science and Stanford, but from the same professors. Literally, they were so homogenous. And one of the things they realized is, well, is it a surprise that all these people think the same? It is. But what we learned when we were creating teams that really perform well is that it really doesn't help us to have 4 people with the same way of viewing a problem. What helps is when we have 4 people with 4 different ways of viewing the problem, 4 different life experiences, 4 different skill sets, right? The way a designer thinks about a problem, the way an engineer thinks about a problem, the way a product manager thinks about a problem, they're intentionally different. They're necessarily different. And that's what we want. We want that diversity of views. We want different educations. We want different approaches, because hopefully, and this is the magic I was trying to describe. You could feel every day your prototypes get closer and closer to something you can really feel proud of. And that's because everybody is banging up against it and we're coming up with something. You're sort of feeding it into something great. So it is a dynamic that's not calm. It's very passionate. We talk a lot about missionaries versus mercenaries. I try to tell leaders the last thing you want is a product team that just does what you tell it to do. That is the last thing you want. You want a team that feels like, yes, this is an important problem, and I am committed to making sure that this is a great solution. If everybody on your team feels that way, you're going to have a much better chance of great result.
You talk about kind of that feeling. You just reminded me of an incident that I joined this company, and I just heard about an engineering manager that had just been demoted from an engineering manager to like a principal engineer. I said, why? What happened? They said, well, we had a company meeting. Some of our executives and leaders had an idea for a new product and a new platform. And, he raised his hand and asked for an explanation. And after they explained it, he's like, that's a stupid idea. And, our HR department said, we don't want some people embarrassing our executives that way. And, we demoted him. And so I kind of went to go, so I said, I need to go speak to this person. And I spent time with the person and stuff. The next week I went to the HR department and I said, this should be your head of engineering. We should promote him. They said, what do you mean? We just demoted him. I said, well, first of all, he actually did stop the company from making what was probably a very stupid decision. But more importantly, he was not afraid to speak up. And you need to encourage that. These are not just tell me what to build people. You don't want a whole team of people that, empowered engineers. They don't want to work on things they don't believe in. They don't want to work on things they don't buy into. And you want that argument because it creates that ownership, that accountability in some ways. And, I had to do some digging, but I said, culturally, you have to have a culture of where people feel safe to speak up, where a leader can say more why you don't think it's going to work, where we can break that down in the environment, But it kind of brings me to this dynamic of engineers and pulling your engineers into work. So that, unfortunately, it's not so common in many companies as I would have thought. Understanding the role of engineers, I see so many companies still treat this function as factory workers, tell them what to do, kind of crank out the system. Give me some sense of why you still think this is prevalent today.
Well, this is one of my first and best signs when I visit a company for the first time, what kind of culture it really is, how they treat their engineers. If they think of their engineers as basically just order takers to build whatever somebody dreams up, I know, first of all, that it's not going to be very impressive products. There was almost never going to be any innovation. They're just order takers. They're just mercenaries. What we want, of course, are engineers that feel that they are passionate about coming up with not just any solution, but a solution that really works, so where they can take ownership for that solution. And that means they need to be first-class members of the product team. We should call this out, even though I know to you and I, this would be ridiculous, but there are many companies in the world where their engineers are not even employees. They're contractors. They're outsourced. When I run into a company like that, it's time for an immediate heart-to-heart with the CEO and the CFO. And I explain to them, first of all, why you won't get the innovation you're looking for. But then the part that really surprises them, I also try to explain to them why they're wasting money. They're spending more money. And, the CFO's initial response is, oh no, our loaded cost of an engineer in India is a fraction of what it is in Europe or the US. And so we're saving money. I'm going, no, you're not. Look at the size of these teams. They're twice the size of what a team should be. If you actually look at the total cost of a team and then you compare it to the outcomes they generate, you're burning money. And of course, this really frustrates CFOs, but they start, all I'm really trying to do is say, look, you don't have to trust me. Run a test. See who's right.
We've always argued that the best ideas come from engineers, the most innovative ideas come from engineers. And you kind of talk about cost to companies. It's a lot of waste. I've seen when I ask people, where do your engineers spend their time? I can almost tell, depending on how they describe that answer, what kind of operating model they are in. They are like coding. That's what they do. They just ship things. It's almost a very delivery-centric delivery team model. Interestingly enough, I also get this. My engineers are in meetings all day long. And it quickly points me to a future team. Because, engineers are trying to get clarity about what people want in that roadmap item or in that project and clarify the requirements. And, I often pull that data out to executives and I say, let's go through your organization. And you say, you've got product managers in meetings, designers in meetings, engineers in meetings. Who is solving problems? Who is working in your organization to think critically about the best way to do things, the best solution to a problem. And so it's very wasteful when we kind of say we're not getting the traction that we like. We're not getting the value out of engineers that you will. I think an important coaching tip, Marty, and maybe you can say more about this because I've seen the magic of it happen when people bring their engineers along in discovery or to see customers. You want to say a little about that in your experience, what you've seen happen?
Well, I tell teams the magic happens when they bring along engineers to visit customers. It is amazing. Partly because they're seeing their products in the real world, for better or for worse. They're seeing the reactions. Part of it is because they know what's just now possible. But a very related coaching tip, Christian, since you brought it up, and because a lot of product managers, probably listening to this. This drives me nuts, but so many product managers, they tell me the reason they don't bring their engineers along is because they believe it's their job to shelter the engineers from everything but coding. And of course, that these are people that I have to kind of restrain myself and make sure that I don't get violent. But I just explain to them, I say, the single biggest complaint I get from engineers is that the product manager, if they would have talked to us even for 5 minutes about an idea before some silly promise was made, they could have saved months worth of damage. And, the biggest mistake they make is not including engineers. And the ironic thing is it doesn't even take much time. It doesn't take much time every day. But if the product team is not including the engineers every day for at least, 15 to 30 minutes on what is coming next and why, they will regret that. And they'll also lose when it comes to innovation.
I've told people some of the best products and best product teams I have met, I've seen in the world. The engineer can almost always talk about the customer. They can always put by name. They could say, I met somebody named Marty that had this problem. They are not connecting to a Jira story or ticket number 524 on some ticketing system for what led to it. They are very connected to it. So it's an absolutely magical thing. But what I don't want to underscore, because we've kind of talked about, we've got to work together. We've got to bring this diverse group of people together. We recognize that disagreements are inevitable in product work. In fact, I want people to expect disagreements. It's kind of, we're making some of that argument. But truly, how do you handle this when they occur on a product team, or, you're working with a group of talented people, or even with different layers of seniority, and there's a disagreement?
Right. Well, the first thing, the high order bit, is to encourage that disagreement. Encourage it, because that's the friction we were talking about. So you want to encourage. In fact, there are some great techniques to elicit the disagreements that most people wouldn't be comfortable saying. So we want to make sure that disagreements, get them out on the table now. This is the right time. It'll help. It'll make sure we think differently. We'll look at it differently, and we'll consider that. At some point, of course, we also have to make decisions. Especially, this is one of the, I think, best parts of an empowered product team, is the idea is to push decisions down to the team. So that means the teams have to make decisions. And if you've got both disagreement and the need to make a decision, you could be stuck for a while if you don't have a way to get resolution. Normally, and I like to give people the whole sort of nuance here, the lay of the land, because there's a lot of different situations. But normally, we defer to the person with expertise in that. So if it's an engineering issue, we defer to the engineering leader, the tech lead, and say, this is your space. You should make the call. If it's a user experience, a customer experience issue, we'll usually defer to the designer. It's like, say, look, you're the one trained in that. Tell us what the best answer is right there. And if it's an issue around, say, business viability, we defer to the product manager. That's our sort of first rule of thumb. Sometimes, even when you do that, there is still serious disagreement. And so the next strategy is to run a test. And this is, of course, now gets into techniques, but we have better techniques than we have ever had in the product world in order to quickly get resolution, to quickly get data. Sometimes it's proof, sometimes it's just evidence, but we run a test and we'll say, look, this is one of those things, it's just difference of opinions, let's run a test. And when we all see the results of the test, we're all looking at that together. It's usually, the disagreement evaporates, because we can now all say, all right, well, we've seen what happens. This works, or it doesn't work, one or the other. So we run a test. The last resort, and I'm not going to say this never happens, because it does, but the last resort is, especially if it's a consequential decision where, resources of the company could be put at risk, then we'll escalate it. We'll say, all right, this is something we need to talk to the engineering leader about, or to the product leader about. And maybe you need to make sure they can't anticipate another issue, or you just want to get on a level of confidence. That's kind of our fallback plan. But even when we do that, I encourage the teams to take a recommendation to those people.
One of the unfortunate things in our work that I've often struggled with is the amount of arrogance or ego, that really I feel is very much a cancer in the desire for people to be right, the desire for them to get validation that their idea wins. So it's the right idea. And this false sense that the price of our work is that I was the one that came up with the idea or the solution, or I won that argument. And I see so many rooms with people with just opinions, and it's often coaching for product teams to recognize. We always say like evidence beats opinions. And I always like to tell people, in many cases, people say, well, it's not proof. I say, well, evidence gets you arrested, proof puts you in jail. And the idea here is like, in many cases, we've made so many decisions with just opinions in here, but do we even have enough to compel us to take action here in some ways? And so I love how you've called out here, one, deferring to the person with expertise. Where I've seen that being challenged is if you don't believe that person has the expertise, then you start to argue back. You're like, yeah, you don't really know our business for you to say that. And so it's calling back again. What good work looks like is that those cross-functional skills are people with expertise in those areas, right? That helps your disagreement. And then, kind of running the tests and going and escalating by bringing recommendations. Now, you talk about escalating, and I know we can't really unlock the real nature of product without discussing this group called stakeholders. First of all, Marty, one of the biggest things I've seen with many teams struggle is the definition of a stakeholder. What's your definition of a stakeholder, Marty?
Yeah. I mean, at one level, everybody in the company cares about the product, so they could be literally considered a stakeholder, especially if they have any stock in the company, something like that. But normally, practically speaking, first of all, if you're unsure of who your real stakeholders are, if you're, say, a product manager who is responsible for understanding the constraints of their stakeholders, if you have any uncertainty at all, go to your manager. If your manager doesn't know who your stakeholders are, you're in trouble. So you should absolutely. But the general rule of thumb is, do they have veto power? So, for example, most people would agree the CEO has veto power. Chief legal officer has veto power. The head of sales often has veto power, especially if it has anything to do with something that's going to be sold through his or her sales channel. So there are several key leaders that they can say, look, I'm responsible, or the CFO, I'm responsible for the economics of this company. I'm responsible for the costs. I'm responsible for the monetization. And no, this is not okay. We can't afford this. That's veto. So there are a set of stakeholders in every company that have that responsibility to protect the assets of the company. And that those are stakeholders, absolutely. And it is the job of the product manager to know what each of those stakeholders are concerned about. This is usually the biggest part of onboarding for a new product manager. Because look, marketing, sales, the whole go-to-market in general, services, legal, compliance, finance, all this, they all have constraints. They're all trying to do their part of the business. And so a product manager, remember, the designer doesn't know those things. Designer has a huge job. It's a totally different job around the user and their experience with our product, how they interact and touch our product. The engineers don't know these things. They have a huge job around the building of our products and the delivery of our products. It is the product manager that needs to represent these issues. That's why the product manager is the key person to represent the different stakeholders. Now, of course, if you don't have a product manager, then what most people do is they just have these big meetings of a bunch of stakeholders and let them fight it out themselves. And that's referred to as design by committee. And very few good products come through that path.
When my early teams, my last operational role asked me like, who is this my stakeholder? I always used to tell them the story of the chicken and the pig, like the chicken goes to the pig and says, let's start a restaurant. It's like, what are we going to call it? It's like bacon and eggs. And the pig thinks for a while. It's like, I'm going to pass. And I say, on one end, to get eggs, the chicken is just going to contribute, but you got to kill the pig to get bacon. I say real stakeholders should actually be enablers of innovation, not just blockers. They are not the people that say they've got a stake in it. It's the very definition of the name. And if they cannot say no and your product doesn't go, they are just someone that cares. And that's okay. There's a level between someone's level of interest and someone's level of influence. I think many companies do struggle because even everybody in the company themselves feel like they are a stakeholder. And people feel like their job is to please all those people and to ensure that they've checked the box for them. I think what we've always coached is you got to think them a high fidelity prototype of what you're trying to create, not some PowerPoint or keynote or some document, because they are riddled with assumptions, right? And you got to do a walkthrough with them, not a demo. You're not a test. You're not your user, but real stakeholders. Their job is, again, in some ways, to protect our revenue, protect our brand, our customers, and our fellow employees. So how we interact with them is really an important part of what good teams do. Now, speaking of people say no and objections and understanding those things, one of the challenges I think I hear with teams are really around the constraints in their environment. In short, I've actually had a team earlier this morning that said, we brought all the evidence and our leader still said no. And, and I said, why did they say no? Is it not the right time? Are they constraints you don't understand? But maybe Marty, talk about being proactive in understanding constraints and when that falls in doing good work.
This is a very important one that applies to definitely stakeholders, but more generally as well. We need to understand what those concerns are, for sure. And one of the things that's so difficult in product is if the stakeholder does not feel that the product manager in particular does not understand the real constraints. If they think that person has not done the work to really understand the needs of the business, they won't trust that person. This is essential that we build that level of trust, that level of confidence that they know we understand. One of my favorite techniques that I coach people on is if you really want to make somebody a critical stakeholder not only feel valued and trusted, but heard, when you propose something, anticipate the objections. This is actually part of Amazon's PRFAQ process. It's part of their product model at Amazon. But the idea is you should, as the product manager, you should anticipate those objections. If you've been listening, you know what their concerns are. If you literally write out the objection, just like you think that executive would say it or think it, number one, write it out on a document and then think hard about the right answer. Collect the evidence like you talked about that you need, but say, we think this is a legitimate concern. This is how we're addressing that. This is how we propose to address that. Now, at Amazon, you put this together in something called a PRFAQ, and the FAQ are these anticipated questions. What's really amazing to see is if you show those objections and the response to the stakeholders, first of all, they're like, oh my gosh, Christian actually listened to me.
That's right.
That's awesome. He actually listened. Number one, he listened. Number two, he gets it. And I feel like the solution he's proposing respects those constraints. And they might say, this is great, Christian. I appreciate you doing this. I think we could also worry about this. And here's what we might be able to do. And, you can get into a dialogue. But it is amazing how that turns it around when you show people that you have been listening and you have heard and you are respecting those constraints. I do this all the time. One of the things that really drives me nuts on social media is so many people think product is just about making your customers happy. And I'm like, oh, I wish it was that easy. I really, really wish it was that easy. And I don't always do this, but sometimes I will respond to somebody and saying, if they do that, they still fail. And what's really going on here is you also have to solve for the business. And this is a terrific tool for solving for the business and building that trust that we need along the way.
I love that. Well, what a great coaching tip, and to your point, when people ask me what makes product hard, I say, well, we talk about those two sides. You've got to do things customers love, but also work for your business. I actually think it's easier to think about things to delight customers, but to do it in a meaningful enough manner within the constraints of your business. This is what real product management is about. And I hope people can get that from when we talk about the nature of product work, is that box in which the constraints in which we play in and to try to innovate within It's part of the challenge in the job. Last thing here, Marty, as we wrap up, you're kind of bringing in things about kind of domain expertise and domain dogma and some of those things in here around the thinking. I do work with a lot of banks too as well, and I often, I hear two arguments. One is we're big and the other is we're regulated, right? We can't innovate in that. We can't do all of this product work. We can't do good work. By good work, I mean, we need to tell people what to do. We need to be prescriptive. We can't do all these things you're talking about. How do you respond to that?
One of the things I'm most excited about with the new book is that we intentionally, and Christian knows this, but for the listeners, we intentionally picked all the examples, the case studies in the book are from outside Silicon Valley. They're from regulated industries, financial services industries, healthcare industries. These are difficult industries because of, just like you say, they are regulated industries. And we are showing companies that have not only managed to change, but to able to then innovate in a way they could never have done before. So I'm excited because the truth is, Christian, there are always objections, and most of them are legitimate objections. They're like, I don't see how I do this. I'm a CFO. I don't see how we're supposed to do this. And so they just want to know, what is the right answer there? What is your answer to that? But sometimes people just resort to the tried and true, well, we're different. We can't do this. I see it all, hear it all the time. It's sort of the easiest cop-out there is. And I am hoping the new book stops that once and for all. I mean, I know it never can. Of course, people will say, well, we're in, Malaysia. We can't do that. No, you can.
Yeah, you're going to find a reason. And I've argued a whole lot when I hear things of scale and size. And I say, you're actually making the argument for more product work, for better discovery, for a better way of working. Because in some ways, there's more risk to be tackled. There are harder problems, harder constraints. And so I actually tell people when they kind of push back, I say, you're probably looking at this the wrong way, because all your teams, your leaders are seeing you as those people trying to make customers happy without thinking about what's good for us. And, so you kind of brought up a good point around really making it work for the business when they can say, they get it. They are really trying to make us make profit, at the same time create delighted customers. They are really trying to grow revenue, at the same time create loyal customers. And that's the very nature of good product work. Marty, as usual, it has been nothing but a joy to spend this last couple of minutes with you. Thank you again for the gift of your wisdom and your time. For everybody listening, as always, be kind. We will see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. Want to learn more? Until next time, please check out svpg.com. Sign up for our newsletter that Marty Kagan puts out. Join us for one of our workshops near you and get access to all of the articles and content we put out. In addition to our current books, we are very excited about our new book, Transform, which helps companies move to the product model. Marty, why don't you take some time to tell us about Transformed and why we wrote it?
We wrote inspired for product teams. We wrote empowered for product leaders. And the good news is that a lot of people seem to buy that and read it and like it. We love that. However, the most common question we've been getting for years is that the way we describe in that book, the way of working we describe, and how they work today is so different that people, their first reaction is it even possible to make the degree of change needed in order to move to this product model? And we wanted to answer that question with this book. It's broader than our other books where we're focused on product people. This is focused at everybody in the company, from the CEO on down to every stakeholder who wants to know how they can engage with the product teams constructively. The book talks about a dozen examples of companies that have successfully transformed to the model and what they've been able to do since they've been able to transform. And it talks about really what are the principles that are important in working this way.
Thank you, Marty, for joining us here today. And as always, for sharing your insights. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Until next time, have a good day.
A quick disclaimer: while this podcast is named Product Therapy, it is not hosted by licensed therapists or mental health professionals, and it is in no way a substitute for professional mental health services. We recognize the importance of mental well-being and encourage anyone facing personal difficulties to seek support from qualified professionals. See www.findahelpline.com.